Hello to all of you. Thank you for attending this panel, which is entitled Studying Phonetic Adaptation in Interaction. Thank you all for being here for another panel from Abralim ao Vivo. My name is Jennifer Albuquerque, and I'm a faculty member of the Universidade Tecnológica Federal do Paraná, and I will be here to mediate the session. I'll be asking questions and also taking questions from the audience. You're all invited, right? So to type your questions in the chat, and we especially ask you to indicate who you would like to answer the questions, or if the questions are for both of them, okay? Both of our guests here today. I would like to give a special thanks to our technical support. And our panelists here today are Navin Viswanathan, who is a faculty member of the Penn State University, and Anne Olmstead, who is also from the Penn State University. So we are more than welcome to have you here. I'm sure we are going to have like a wonderful talk, and then I pass over to you, Navin.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I will share my screen and we'll just make sure that everything is good and then I can get started. Thank you. Okay, wonderful. And I'm just gonna. All right, so I just want to make sure that you're seeing the slideshow rather than the presenter view. So please interrupt me if that is not the case. Again, we want to thank the organizers for giving us an opportunity to share our work. We're extremely honored that we get to present to this audience, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Any questions you may have and any criticisms you may have as we present our work. So thank you. So as you can see from the title of the talk, today I'm going to be talking about phonetic processes as they happen in communicative interaction. I'm using the word adaptation to indicate any kind of phonetic change that serves communication, that makes communication smoother or better. So that's the definition that I'm employing. This is collaborative work with Annie Olmstead, who's also in the audience, and we will take questions together at the end of the talk. And so let me get started here. So when we think about spoken language processes, any investigation into spoken language processes implicitly or explicitly assumes the speech chain. So let me lay this out. Usually the idea is that the speaker starts with the message that she wishes to convey, and she does so through carefully coordinated actions of the vocal tract. And this results in a structured speech signal, which then the listener can extract the structure from to derive this message. Right? And if this process went on fairly smoothly, these messages are alike. Now, there are those of us who really focus on the first part of the process. So they focus on the speech production questions. For example, one may ask questions such as, what are the planning difficulties when we are producing a complex message? Are the acoustic kinematic properties of production that leads to the structured signal? There are others. A lot of our work focuses on speech perception questions, where we're thinking about how it is that the listener is able to go from this structured regularity in the speech signal to the message. In another line of work, we're focused on how is it that despite all the speech variability, the listener is able to extract the message. What you may notice is that these enterprises, the speech production and speech perception, can largely proceed without explicitly having to involve the other component. Okay, and so often what we see in such investigation, typical studies, is that you have a study of individual language users who's not communicating to anybody in particular. We have excellent experimental control as a result, and this can be very useful if we're trying to understand the individual mechanisms. And this means that most of the accounts of speech perception and production have been derived from experimental findings in such carefully controlled settings. Often this has been termed as the language as product approach. Now, when we look, of course, spoken language occurs in a whole variety of settings, and importantly, it happens when it's embedded in a variety of physical and social environments. Now, the challenge for us is to ensure that the theories that we develop using the really controlled settings can in fact generalize to cognition in the wild, language use in the wild. The focus of today's presentation of the current project is to study spoken language use. We are studying it at the phonetic level, and we are trying to use paradigms that involve communicative interaction. We will have people interacting with each other, and we are going to try our best to retain experimental control. We are heavily borrowing from this other tradition of studying language, which is the language as action tradition. Okay. So before we can do that, we have to kind of reassess our speech chain assumption and say that if we're truly studying interaction, this is an incomplete conceptualization of what happens. So the speech production to speech perception chain happens, but that is complemented by the interlocutors. I'm using the word interlocutors to refer to conversation partners. So we both are in conversation, we both are interlocutors. So the speech chain is necessarily complemented by the opposite process where the interlocutors can switch roles. So maybe it is better for us to conceptualize this as a speech loop. And we are particularly interested in the interface. What are the changes that happen during interaction? Now, we focus on the phonetic level for a couple of reasons. One, that is our level of interest, but also interestingly, there are a range of phonetic phenomena that we can utilize to understand, to examine this particular question of phonetic adaptation in interaction. Now, the first such phenomena is called phonetic convergence. And I have interactive in parentheses because this phenomenon is not always examined in true interaction. But I'll give you an example where it is in fact done so. This is the classic finding from Pardo 2006, where interlocutors in a conversation after interaction begin to sound like each other, or during the interaction begin to sound like each other. So, for example, if we have, let's say we are participating in Pardo's experiment, and I am the director and you are the matcher, what happens is we both have copies of this map. The only difference is that as a director, I have the route that you see, the dotted line drawn through this map, whereas you don't have that route. And now my task is to instruct you, to tell you how to draw this route so that our maps match, essentially. Okay, so I will give you directions, and good luck, because I have a terrible sense of direction. But I go through this and I go, okay, you start and you go down the caravan park, and I want you to loop back up in between the caravan park and the old mill, and so on. And you may interrupt me and you may say things like, wait, do you want me to go around the caravan park or around the old mill? And I say, no, what we have to do is you have to draw it in between the caravan park and the old mill. What you may have noticed is that in doing the task, you've already heard me produce, for example, the phoneme ka in the context of caravan park multiple times. So now we can look at specific segments that we've targeted through the design of such maps, and we can look at this and we can analyze different phonetic aspects of these productions. So, for example, we can look at voice onset time differences or vowel length differences, the length differences of the whole word, or specific form and frequencies, and so on. So we can look at different acoustic landmarks, and the findings of phonetic convergence approximately look like this. The interlocutors start off far away, and through interaction, they start to approach each other. That's the idea of convergence. Now, there's an alternate way of assessing convergence, and this is the perceptual assessment. Instead of looking at the acoustic landmarks, what I can do is I can bring in a separate group of judges, a separate group of listeners who did not participate in the task, and I give them an AXB judgment task. What I mean by this is I can take the productions of Caravan Park from partner 2 as an example, and I put that as the reference X. And then I compare the pre-task performance, pre-task productions of Caravan Park from partner 1 and the post-task productions of partner 1 as token B. And the listener's task here is to decide whether the first or the last production is most like the middle. What Pardo found, and many other studies subsequently have found, is that often post-task productions are judged to be more similar to the interlocutor. This indicates that as we have worked together, we now sound similar as judged by a neutral listener. Okay, other orientations, other configurations are possible for the AXP. I'm using this to illustrate this perceptual judgment of convergence. Now, what is interesting is that these kind of holistic perceptual judgments, I say holistic because the listener is presumably listening to the whole production rather than a specific acoustic attribute. These holistic perceptual judgments and the underlying acoustic change don't always go hand in hand. It doesn't seem clear exactly what underlies these judgments. Interestingly, whether we use the acoustic convergence measures or the perceptual measures, AXP measures, we see that across a range of studies that the extent of convergence or whether or not convergence happens is affected by a whole host of factors. It could depend, for example, on the biological sex of the talker. It could depend on how engaged I am in the task. It can depend on whether or not I like my partner, so on and so forth. For our purposes today, we are going to conclude is that phonetic convergence appears to be pervasive. So we see it across a whole host of studies, but yet it seems to be unreliable. We don't always see it in the same dimensions with the same interlocutors, etc. And it is definitely not fully understood. That's the take-home message for now with phonetic convergence. Now, let's turn to another phonetic phenomenon that has been very well studied at the phonetic level, and this is one of clear speech. So clear speech refers to the kind of speech production changes that I, as a speaker, make when I encounter some kind of communication difficulty. And this can be a real communication difficulty. Like, for instance, if my background got really noisy, I'm going to make specific changes to my speech to get my message across. Or it can be imagined communication difficulty where you instruct me and you say, why don't you talk like you're talking to someone who's hard of hearing? And that's going to change the particular changes that I make. So this is the example where I'm in a really crowded setting and then I'm trying to talk. This can also, as I said, can change when you have either an imagined interlocutor, the partner who's listening to you, or an actual interlocutor. The whole host of findings that show that we change our speech if we're addressing our speech to children, or to older individuals, to non-native speakers, and so on. And so we notice specifically that these clear speech changes can happen at the global level, which means I can slow down my rate of speech, maybe a little bit like what I'm doing now to make particular points, increase my intensity, speak louder, accentuate my fundamental frequency changes, etc. And that happens across the speech stream, hence we call them kind of global changes. We have an example here from Weiland et al. All we need for today's presentation is that the dotted line depicts the clear speech condition and the solid line depicts the habitual speech condition. And what you're looking at is what is called vowel space area. For us, all that means is how distinct are the vowels. And in the clear speech condition, you can see that this area is larger, possibly driven by, again, accompanying changes in speech rate. But the speakers in the clear speech condition make their vowel productions more distinct, and presumably this helps their listeners. Even more interestingly, at least for our purposes, is that speakers can also make specific changes to individual segments. Beyond just slowing down how I speak and beyond just speaking louder, I can change subphonemic properties of my production to alleviate particular phonetic confusions. This is evidence in this study from Schertz 2013. And here she's looking at voicing productions. And if I am responding to an error in voicing, I accentuate those properties of my production that's going to disambiguate a voiced stop from a voiceless stop, for instance. And there are many other studies that demonstrate this. For, again, our take-home message here is that if we're going to study interactions, we expect that when communication issues arise, we expect speakers to use both global and segmental changes. We'll go to the final phenomena here, and then we can, kind of take this together. Now, the two that I've talked about, phonetic convergence and clear speech, really refer to production changes. But there is plenty of evidence that shows that when you're listening to speech, as a listener, you're not just passive, you're constantly adapting to your speaker. There is evidence that we can use lexical information, I can use dialectal information, how quickly this, the rate of speech, et cetera, to alter my perception in a context-appropriate fashion. Okay, a very classic study now is, one of lexical retuning, where the same kind of ambiguous segments are heard differently depending on the lexical context they're embedded in. And this leads to a learning effect such that native phonetic boundaries can change after being exposed to such speech. Now, we have a similar study that utilizes this paradigm and in our lab, and what we found was that we can use this kind of an effect to improve the discrimination of difficult non-native contrasts. Again, for today, perceptual learning can operate such that native categories are altered, as well as non-native categories are altered. Now, all of these studies, especially these kind of retuning studies, use these kind of language as product paradigms, these individual settings. And I use the word curated because they're carefully assembled stimuli that are then manipulated to index these perceptual changes. So the interactive up there in the parenthesis is kind of generous because we don't truly have interactive studies that show perceptual learning, that document perceptual learning of the kind that I'm talking about. But nevertheless, we think it's a fair assumption that when listeners are talking to each other, they are likely to perceptually adjust to their interlocutors during interaction. Okay, so now we have the three phonetic phenomena that we care about. We're about to study interaction. And as we're doing so, we have to really consider the predictions of the most prominent account of conversational interaction. This is one called the interactive alignment model, proposed by Pickering and Garrod in 2004 and updated in 2013. So per this account, essentially, the goal of conversation, the goal of communicative interaction is alignment. What do I mean by that? I'm borrowing their figure from their 2004 paper, which clearly illustrates that the way we can align our messages, you can see in the top, and these are the two speakers, one on blue and one in red. The way the messages can be aligned is for the speakers to align their semantic and situation models. So alignment serves to help communication And this can happen across different levels. You can see in this figure that it can happen in the phonetic and the phonological level, which is our level of focus, at the lexical, syntactic, and so on. Now, if we are similar to each other, if the two interlocutors are similar to each other, it is more likely that they will align. Conversely, of course, if we're looking at dissimilar interlocutors, which is going to be our focus pretty soon, alignment processes are disrupted. Okay. So in the 2004 paper, the idea was that this alignment happens through priming. In the 2013 paper, Pickering and Garrod have updated their model to specifically pinpoint prediction mechanisms. And I will kind of outline those mechanisms in the context of the phonetic level that we care about in the next slide. But what the key point is that alignment is helpful for communication. So in the words that I used, alignment is adaptive for communication. Okay. So let's look at the phonetic simulation model. This is the application of the interactive alignment model to the phonetic level. This is Gambi and Pickering, 2013. And they outline two specific routes that listeners can use while listening to speech. So the first route is called prediction by simulation. Remember that the whole idea during communication is to try and predict your partner and therefore easing any communication issues. So here you have the speaker, they produce the message, it's the same figure I used before. According to this model, the way the listener understands the speaker, if they employ the simulative route, is that they utilize their own production system, their own motor system, to simulate the productions of their interlocutor. Now, this idea precedes this particular model, has often been termed analysis by synthesis, and it's one of the fundamental claims of the motor speech, the motor theory of speech production, and that the phonetic simulation model takes that idea further by saying the reason why we see alignment, especially, for example, at the phonetic level, where we see phonetic convergence, is that because I've just used my motor system to simulate my partner, there are carryover effects that then color my subsequent productions. So I start to sound like the partner that I just simulated. And therefore, you can see these kind of convergence effects. And this is the default route. This is the preferred route for alignment for prediction. Now, there are several things that can interfere with the simulated route. And in those cases, we need another route. And this is the prediction by association route. In the prediction by association route, I can no longer simulate my partner. I don't use my motor system. Instead, I use associative links in memory to retrieve the message. And in that case, presumably, you do not expect convergence to happen. Perhaps the other patterns that I just outlined may occur as a result. So we have the default simulative route, and we have the associative route when simulation is disrupted. Now, I foreshadowed this question, which is to really wonder what happens if the interlocutors in the interaction are mismatched. What do I mean by that? I mean, if the interlocutors have, for example, different language backgrounds. I mean, if the interlocutors are mismatched in their language abilities. What happens from this particular model? Well, Costa et al. Examined this question in fair detail, and they argued that alignment in these kind of mixed pairs, if you're looking at L1, native speakers and non-native speakers, L2, you may find that alignment in such pairs may be impaired. Now, this can happen because L2 processing is effortful. It can also happen because we are so different, the L1 and the L2 speakers, that alignment cannot happen. They also suggest that when you look at L2 pairs who are speaking in their L1, the effortful processing may disrupt alignment, but because of the similarity, we may see some remnants of it, some weak alignment. Okay. Kim et al. Really experimentally examined this question. And what they found was that the extent of alignment that we see between non-native interlocutors may really depend on how unlike each other they are, linguistically speaking. In their reasoning, there are intelligibility needs that the interlocutors have to meet, as well as the demands of this effortful non-native processing. The intelligibility needs, per the interactive alignment model, should lead to alignment. The demands on the non-native processes should disrupt alignment. And it's a constant battle between these processes. We examine this question by explicitly asking whether non-native speakers can imitate segments from native speakers. So let me illustrate this here and orienting you to this graph. On the x-axis, we have tokens that vary from pre-voice, these are the negative VOT, pre-voice VOTs, to the long lag VOTs that are in the positive. What you see are two curves. The dark curve are English native speakers, and the lighter curve are the Spanish native speakers. And what both groups of speakers were asked to do was to listen to a token and imitate it as faithfully as possible. And these tokens varied from the long lag negative 60 to the pre-voice negative 60 to the long lag positive 60. What we found was that when you look at the long lag region, our English speakers were able to follow the subphonemic changes in VOT, whereas our non-native speakers were relatively flat. This is the region right of the blue bar. But we see the opposite pattern in the pre-voice region, where our Spanish speakers show sensitivity to small changes, whereas our English speakers are relatively flat. We have a corresponding experiment in perception. Together, what we take these results to mean is that the ability to converge is going to be constrained by the phonetic repertoire, the phonetic skills of the interlocutors in question. I assume that if we had, for example, Portuguese speakers, we'd see pretty similar effects because of the way that the voice and continuous partition is similar. Nevertheless, Huang et al. Demonstrated that non-native speakers may still make specific changes in order to assist their native interlocutor. So it really remains to be explained how these kind of mismatched interlocutor pairs navigate the difficult phonetic challenges. And that's our question. But before we turn to that question, there is the other domain that we are particularly interested in our research group, and that is looking at what happens when you look at interlocutors with mode speech disorder or other language disorders. And there is a lot of evidence there in those domains that show that alignment processes are disrupted. So how is it that those pairs can achieve communicative success? That is something that we're trying to answer as well. So that's why we really focused on mismatched interlocutors. Okay. So in order to answer questions of this sort, we've been exploring a range of tasks that involve true interaction. I'll describe a couple of those tasks and really focus in on one of the tasks that we are using for the current study. Happy to talk about the other tasks that we've explored later on. But we bring in pairs of interlocutors. This was, pre-COVID, of course. And, we put the speaker in a sound booth so that we can get really high quality productions, and we link them up through an audio interface, and we ensure, at least for this first series of experiments, that they cannot actually see each other. and they may perform, and we give them specific roles similar to what Pardo did in her phonetic convergence study. Again, other tests, we don't have these roles predefined, just for information. So, let's say that you and I are going to be working together. Again, let me be the director, and we are working on something like a collaborative picture matching task. We both see these two pictures. Only I, as the director or the speaker, get this highlight. And my job is to say, I may say pair or click on the pair depending on the instructions. And if you click on the right picture, we both get feedback saying, yeah, we made it. Now, this is, a non-trivial problem to solve, distinguishing between bear and pair, especially if you have mixed interlocutors who partition the voicing space differently. So we haven't done this study yet, but if we used our speakers from our previous study, our Spanish and English speakers, we anticipate that they will have initial difficulty, and we are particularly interested in trying to see how they adjust with respect to each other. We ask a similar question with our current group of participants. Now, we can also create specific difficulties even with native pairs. Now, for example, this, you see this pair of pictures, and I say pedal. And if you're an American English speaker, most dialects of American English don't really distinguish the medial consonant in these two possibilities. And they're both realized as voiced flaps. So I may say pedal and we get it wrong. And then next time, maybe I'm going to clarify and I'm going to say petal versus pedal as an example. Today, I'm going to be talking about a study that utilizes collaborative word matching. It's basically the same thing, except we don't have to use pictures. We are not restricted to just the imageable tokens. And it permits us to use some classic vowel context, which is what we are really focused on in this study. So again, pedal and we can do the same thing. In principle, it's the same, except now it's words on the screen that you're matching, that you're choosing from, two words. Okay, so to remind ourselves, the question in front of us is as follows. We want to understand how it is that interlocutors with different language backgrounds, that's the mismatch for this particular study, solve this collaborative word matching task. And we deliberately pick phonetic dimensions that we know are going to be difficult for our non-native speakers. We focus on vowels, and we focus on this particularly troublesome pair of vowels. This is the tense versus lax vowels, and for example, E as in beat versus I as in bit. And we also co-vary the post-vocalic consonant voicing, so T versus D. If you take this together, we have four possible stimuli: bit, bid, beat, and bead. You may be asking why these particular stimuli. Most L2 learners of English have trouble with the vowel distinction that I just produced. And that's because English is one of the few languages, kind of annoying, that they use this particular distinction, right? And the consonant distinction in post-vocalic stops has been shown to be difficult. I have a little asterisk, and I'll come back to this asterisk when I discuss the accuracy data. But interestingly, for our purposes, there is past work that shows that when you look at the vowel distinction, E versus A, American English speakers primarily rely on spectral differences. There are tongue position differences that American English speakers rely on, whereas non-native speakers typically achieve this as a length distinction. E is produced as much longer than A. So they have different solutions for the same problem, and we want to see how will they work together when they work with each other. That's the question. The groups that we are looking at are native speakers of Mandarin Chinese, working with native English speakers. This is the mismatched pairs. And we compare those with native speakers of Mandarin Chinese working with other Mandarin Chinese speakers, interlocutors, and these are the like non-native pairs. We have the mismatched pairs and the like pairs, and the like pairs are non-native. And we use Mandarin Chinese because there is evidence that they too have a difficulty with the tense-lax distinction, and some past evidence that shows that the post-vocalic consonant distinction may be difficult. And this difficulty extends in both in perception as well as production. So we thought we have the right group and the right set of stimuli. So the structure of the experimental session looks something like this. So people come in and they perform a word naming task. This is a solo task where it's like a classic word naming without anybody. Then they read a standardized paragraph. We use the stimuli for data. Then they participate in the word matching task with their interlocutor, with their conversation partners. This word matching task has 4 rounds, and we have people switch roles between the rounds in this instantiation of this paradigm. And then after they're done with the interactive task, what they do is they go do the word naming task again in solo. This is the post-task productions. And then we have a brief post-session interview where we get demographic data, language background, experience, etc. Now we can use these kind of pre-task productions to get some accentedness ratings, intelligibility ratings in the case of speakers, for example, with motor speech disorders. We use those kind of productions to get ratings of severity of condition, for example. And we can look across the session now to index changes. Do you see convergence? Do you see clear speech? Do you see any evidence of perceptual learning? I have to caution that in this particular study, we don't directly get at perceptual learning. So we're guilty of the same things that I just said, was problematic in literature. But we are left to infer perceptual learning, and I will illustrate with specific examples. Okay, perfect. Now let's look at the results here. Let's look at accuracy. How well did people do? On the right, I'm going to plot the mixed pairs, and on the left, I'm going to plot the like non-native pairs. Overall accuracy, was it a particularly difficult task? Not really, at least not for both groups of speakers. I apologize, I just realized maybe the video may be obscuring the values, but they're both at 93, for example. Now, interestingly, when the speakers, the interlocutors, have to solve this problem when only the final consonant was different. That is, they have to distinguish the post-vocalic voicing of the final consonant. They did not have trouble. We thought they will struggle with this based on past literature, but no problem there. And when we looked later and analyzed the acoustics of the production, we found that our non-native speakers would exaggerate the release of their stops, would add kind of epenthetic vowels. So they'd say something like bit versus bid, employing some obvious clear speech enhancement to make those distinctions. Of course, in our typical studies, we typically would have, kind of excluded those tokens, but here they were free to use that, and therefore the consonantal distinction was not challenging for this group. So we're going to focus on the vowel distinction. So the vowel distinction, if we look, proved to be challenging. And I say this because remember, chance performance in this paradigm is 50%. Perfect performance is 100%. So they're right in the middle. The like pairs are in the middle, and the mixed pairs are also behaving similarly. So we're going to designate these trials, the vowel minimal pair trials, as the critical trials, and let's look at what happens across the different blocks in the matching task. When we look across the matching task, we see improvement in performance. Both groups start off not as good, and by block 4, they've improved. The linear trends were not significant, but if you just compare block 4 versus block 1, we saw differences. And both groups were not different in how much they improved. Now let's look at the productions, and I'll orient you carefully. Now we're looking at the productions of English speakers in the mixed pairs. Okay, so I've just highlighted that using that picture there. And what you're looking at are, on the x-axis, you're looking at the vowels E versus A. And each pair of bars indicate whether the vowel was produced in a voiced context or a voiceless context. So voiceless in the light green, voiced in the dark green. And we have two panels, one that refers to matching task 1. This is when the speaker first produced these words, and then matching task 2 when they came back and produced, their third round or the fourth round to producing the same words. Okay, so what you find is that when you look at E versus A, we see that English speakers utilize durational differences. They're not pronounced, but they act as a secondary source of information to distinguish these vowels. And they do not accentuate these duration differences, nor do they diminish them the second time they come to speak this. So when you look at duration, there is a duration difference. It's a small difference, it's a significant difference, but it doesn't change across the blocks. Spectrally, now we are looking at F2 on the y-axis and F1 on the x-axis, just raw frequencies rather than any transformations. And our English speakers keep those vowels pretty much distinct. There's a little bit of overlap, and that overlap happens because of inter-speaker differences. And when you look at matching task 2, those differences kind of stay the same. So the English speakers at least don't seem to be making any obvious changes in their production to help their non-native counterparts. What about our L2 speakers in this pair, in the mixed pair? We find our L2 speakers also using duration. The durational differences are not pronounced for those working with English interlocutors. And they seem to slightly increase the duration. I don't think that this difference was significant across the sessions. Spectrally, the story gets interesting. Spectrally, the clear distinction that we saw with the English speakers, we don't see with our L2 speakers. This is documented. If there are small differences between the E and I productions, they're not consistent, which means our English speakers really have to work hard to try and tell them apart, our English listeners. And in the second matching task, the spectral differences don't get accentuated. Now, the most interesting pattern kind of happens when we're looking at the L2 speakers in the like pairs. They start off by using duration. They use duration much more than any of these, the other speakers that we just discussed. And they really accentuate these differences as they go to the second session. The durational differences get really heightened. And I would show this in a different way so that those patterns are much clearer. But it's as though when I'm speaking to another L2 speaker, we start accentuating the changes that we are able to make in order to navigate this difficult phonetic contrast. Spectrally, the clouds are basically on top of each other, and it doesn't seem to change across the matching task. So let's look, how are these vowel distinctions made as we look at duration? Here I'm plotting the pre-test productions, the first matching task, the second matching task, and the post-test. Our English speaker uses a little bit of duration. This is the English speakers in our mixed pairs. The Mandarin speakers use more of duration, especially it seems, during the interaction that it is clear that they're not producing those differences clearly, so they start to accentuate the duration, but nothing like our non-native pairs, which really, who really accentuate these differences. So what we find is that the solution to a given problem, in this case, trying to tell apart this difficult hens-lax vowel, depends on the capability of the speaker as well as who they're interacting with. But before we go, what we found is that we see improvements, right? So when we saw the accuracy measures, we saw that there are improvements. And if you look at the mixed pairs especially, we see that the different pairs seem to be achieving success through different routes. It seems like there are multiple routes to navigating this challenging vowel contrast. So this pair, for example, this is the English speaker in the group, very clear spectral differences. You can see the clouds are apart. That's what we're looking at. That's what we care about. And the Mandarin speaker is doing basically the same thing. They start off doing the same thing. So I don't know if it's convergence, but they are doing what the English speaker is doing. In duration, they look similar, not the same. And so you can see that you get pretty good communicative success when these two interact with each other. But there are also other pairs where something completely different seems to be happening. The English speaker, again, clearly distinguishes the vowels spectrally. The Mandarin speaker, not so much. These colors are shuffled and intermingled, as you can see. And we don't see any differences from block 1 to block 2. And we don't see that in the durational realm as well. So those improvements have to come, presumably, from both interlocutors adjusting perceptually. This is what I meant when I said we are left to infer the perceptual learning part of it, and we're hoping to really go after that by setting up our study to be able to quantify that. But here, that is our inference. How else would our accuracy improve? Perhaps it is perceptual. Perhaps it is also possible that there are other dimensions of production that the pairs are utilizing. I'll give you another example before we move away from this, is that in this situation, the English speaker makes this distinction. The Mandarin speaker seems to start off making this spectral distinction and appears to actually get worse in the second book. And I should have mentioned these handpicked pairs have similar levels of accuracy. That's the key part. They end up with similar levels of accuracy. And in this case, the non-native speaker seems to be destabilized through by the interaction. And we don't see anything happening in the durational dimension either. So the key is that we see improvements in accuracy, we see some changes, but there seem to be multiple routes to achieving the same outcome. Perfect. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to try and present a case for potentially studying interaction from a different perspective, from a dynamical systems perspective rather than a mechanistic perspective as the interactive alignment model utilizes. For that, we will first kind of outline some key principles here, and we turn to this idea of motor synergies or coordinated structures. And what this describes is how multi-element systems with multiple elements, how they work together to achieve a common goal. And these systems are often characterized by what is known as soft assembly. Rather than being mechanically linked, they seem to be informationally linked. And they demonstrate flexibility and self-organization, again, all in service of the task. And there are three key properties that we should be aware of as we think about such multi-element systems. What we are hoping to do is to see whether these ideas, these concepts can help us understand how interlocutors working together, change their production and perception. So that's the backdrop. So the first feature here is one of functional specificity. This is Bernstein's classic example. You observe, he observed a blacksmith working, and he's striking using his hammer. And what Bernstein documented actually was that every swing of the hammer did not look the same. And interestingly, they had different trajectories, but they ended up in the same place. And so the idea was that the muscles and the joints of this blacksmith must assemble themselves differently in service of the task of striking. And so it's the functional specificity that matters rather than individual changes that we should be looking for. And that's one principle of looking for such synergies. Now, the second principle is one of dimensional compression. This is the idea that temporarily these units, these multiple units, can act as though they are a single one. I love looking at this little video where there are multiple fish warding off a predator, and they seem to be working together, sacrificing their degrees of freedom to achieve a common goal. And finally, such systems are characterized by what is called reciprocal compensation. These elements change with respect to each other and often in opposite ways. This is the key. They don't mimic each other, they change in opposite ways. Now, this kind of dynamical systems conceptualization has been successfully applied to studying conversational synergy by Fusaroli and colleagues. And this is a really promising avenue, I think, for us to pursue as we think about these phenomena at the phonetic level. And that's what we attempted to do. We tried to lay out an account of phonetic synergy. We are calling it a fledgling account. I'm hoping you'll be distracted by the cute birds. But it's a fledgling account because we're just starting to kind of sketch out the principles and trying to examine how these three characteristics of synergies may shape interaction at the phonetic level if we assume that is what interlocutors are doing. So let me lay this out kind of carefully. First, when we look at functional specificity, the first thing that comes to our mind is that the task that we use to study phonetic change matters. Specifically, the demands that this task imposes on the interlocutors is going to shape the kind of changes that we observe. If this is true, we don't expect some kind of task invariant default mechanisms. Instead, we will find mechanisms that the task requires for success. That's the first claim. The second claim is that we really need to understand the abilities of the interlocutors. We have to think about the production abilities, the perceptual abilities, but not just abilities, but typical tendencies. And that's going to shape how you and I working together are going to navigate the phonetic space in solving the problem in front of us. Now, as I said earlier, we are particularly interested in looking at accounts that we can use to understand interactions between a healthy interlocutor and one with a communication disorder. So here, really trying to understand the abilities and placing these changes in the context of these abilities becomes crucial. Now, finally, we think that the conditions of the communication matter. We're starting to look at these interactions. We have looked at other situations in kind of non-interactive settings where we are looking at how speech perception processes and speech production processes change in adverse conditions. When I say adverse, it could be noisy, it could be, one person is producing errors, things of that sort. But we think that the conditions are also going to constrain the kind of changes that we're going to observe. Second, let's take the idea of dimensional compression. Remember, it's the multi-elements kind of acting as one. What it means in our context, we think, is that the minimal unit of analysis is a dyad. We cannot look at an individual language user to try and figure out how interactions truly operate. Again, we have other studies that do that, but if we want to truly understand interaction at the dynamical level, we have to start with the dyad. This also means that we cannot study perception and production independent of each other. We look at the loop, and that is what is going to inform what we're going to do. We say that the contributions of the interlocutors then are not linearly separable. I can't really draw a line and say, this is the contribution of speaker one, and that is the contribution of speaker two. And then finally, we think whatever solutions emerge are likely to be partner specific. I realize that this is a different debate and it's a very spirited debate. But if we think of it, if we think of truly interactive tasks, and if we want to understand the solutions that emerge, those solutions are going to necessarily be unique to the partner. This doesn't mean there are not general changes that can go across that interlocutor pair, but we think at least the strongest claim of dimensional compression would indicate that whatever solutions emerge are going to be unique to the whole group, because we cannot separate them beyond the dyad. Finally, reciprocal compensation, me changing with respect to you. As I've said earlier, complementary change is going to be crucial. If we're going to see this kind of flexible stability, interlocutors have to change with respect to each other and sometimes in opposite directions. We have kind of examined this idea briefly when we're looking in a different study, in a different position paper, really, where we're trying to conceptualize what are the contributions to speech intelligibility when speakers with dysarthria or a motor speech disorder are interacting with their communication partners. And the little shaded region is, we've argued that it's really critical to understand the joint contributions of the two partners. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of reciprocal compensation. I'm specifically using this term that these influences are going to be co-constraining. So I'm going to change with respect to each other, but they're also going to be cascading, which means I'm going to change with respect to you, who's going to change with respect to me, who's going to, so it's this process. And so this is necessarily a non-linear process of interaction. So we need a new language to really try and depict that. And then finally, we think all these phenomena and just more generally, perception and production are going to complement each other when you have task demands of this sort. Okay, wonderful. So let me just conclude here. In the current line of work, what we were looking at is what happens when you have mismatched interlocutors and you give them specific phonetic challenges. How do they solve it? That was our question. The interactive alignment model and the phonetic simulation model, they don't really look at mismatched interlocutors. What I mean by that is that, yes, they can certainly explain it using the associative route, but that is seen as a special case. Mismatch is seen as a special case where the default mechanism of simulation is disrupted. In the study that I discussed today, we found that there are multiple ways in which the interacting pairs can organize themselves to solve this phonetic challenge. And we are trying to argue that we need a dynamic account of conversational interaction. What I mean is that we need the most general account that incorporates mismatched as well as matched pairs. So native-native interactions are a special case rather than a default case. In fact, if we really base our theories on native-native interactions, we may get different insights than if we generalize to all kinds of interactions. But I don't mean to imply that this account is in some way better. They're both sorts of accounts really are underspecified in different ways. We think the utility of the dynamical account is that it probably licenses a whole different set of investigations. And we have to do that. We have much work before we can actually kind of develop this account and fully be able to explain the kinds of changes that we are likely to observe. Okay, well, thank you very much. And we are very happy to take questions at this point. We are happy to take questions later on. And this includes criticism as well. So thank you for this opportunity once again, and welcome questions. Thank you. I can stop sharing at this point.
Hello. So
Hi.
here we are again, right? So thank you, well, both of you for the wonderful talk. I think it was very enlightening in terms of basically everything that I studied specifically. I hope for the audience was also very helpful. We do have one question here, and I'm going to read, okay? So the question comes from Professor Viswanathan Alves, and he comments actually, very interesting model. So in a way, should L1 drift attrition phenomena be regarded as examples of phonetic convergence?
And do you want to take this, or okay? I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about convergence, and this is trying to relate kind of the short-term changes that we observe and the long-term consequences. And the initial study, I think, is Sancier and Fowler, looking at Brazilian Portuguese speaker, and there they attempted to make a similar sort of a connection. And so we think, I think it's an interesting idea to pursue. I don't know, again, how well the short-term changes and the long-term drift relate. I don't know, I just mean there's work that has to be done to demonstrate this specifically. But thank you very much for that question. It's a great question.
Annie, would you like to comment anything over that?
No, my understanding is the same as Navin's, that it is really attrition and L1 drift is really this longer term kind of phenomenon typically. And phonetic convergence in conversations occurs in 15 minutes of interacting with one another. It's a very interesting idea and maybe quite powerful, that what goes on in these little tiny conversations is similar in structure to what goes on in these very long interactions between people who have different language backgrounds. But I don't know, as Navin was saying, maybe we need more research to really make a very strong connection between those two things.
And I just remembered something, which is that, I mean, we can look at how long these changes that we observe in task endure. So if there's a way to test, the changes after post-task. So there are studies that show that as soon as you take people out of an interaction and you measure them, those changes go away, and that seemed to be short-term. There are also enduring changes, and I suspect it's going to matter more when we have kind of mismatches, and if we have, for example, L2 speakers and things of that sort. Okay, just speculating here.
Yeah, I'm all about these speculations. I think they trigger very interesting paths on research, right? I'm seeing on the chat to see if whether there is another question or not. I do have two from my own. So while nobody asks there, I might just ask. So you mentioned some important aspects of oral communication, right? So listener not being passive, accommodation of phonective features over time somehow. Do you think that time could play a role in this process? Because then I was wondering about, the complex dynamic systems perspective, and it seems to me that, time could play an important role. And then my interest is that, like, if we conduct research over time, would have interesting results on that. So I would like to see your thoughts on that.
Okay, so I'll go first and then you can go next, right? So I think, I think you're kind of alluding to a very interesting body or kind of interesting program of research that one can pursue, right? So look at the longitudinal changes as they happen. With respect to perceptual learning, there's been this other kind of a dimension, which is this whole idea of consolidation after sleep, what happens, right? So there are these kind of discontinuities in the learning patterns that you see, but we don't know what would happen in the context of interaction, whether this happens. Do you just reset and go back, or do you have kind of partner specific changes already that you can utilize as you go through your third interaction or your fourth interaction? So really, really interesting question. And I think I'm hopeful that we can pursue these with our new capabilities in this world, right? Bringing back the same pair 10 times, hopefully, if we can do it online.
Yes, and I would add that the work that we're doing now that focuses a little bit on trying to capture some of the power of conversational interaction to support clinical interventions for people with speech disorders. That whole idea is predicated on this notion that if we have a short conversation together, we're changing with respect to one another in the conversation, but that those changes are going to at least set us up for something, the next time we have a conversation, we're going to be starting from a different spot at least. And so it would be great to really, as Navin is saying, use this new connected world that we have because of all this online research that we're doing, and really see how that progression unfolds.
Yeah, thank you both for the answers. And then the second question was it is actually a more punctual one, let's say. When you were showing the data on the no-native and also the native speakers, would you say the Spanish no-native and also the Mandarin right pairs, they were able to grasp more like global features? Because then I remember that you both were mentioning something about duration and other aspects that were more connected to global features and others some more segmental ones. So would you say anything connected to that, or is it still like too soon to have any speculation over?
I think it's a great question, and the analysis that we haven't done so far, but we could do to try and tease apart this global versus local, right? So what we plotted there in those graphs were duration differences, right? So they should really take into account overall changes in just lengthening. Now, to really do that, we should have normalized it over the duration of the vowels to see what is the percentage change. We've done that in other studies, other kind of non-interactive studies and clear speech studies to get to exactly this question. But if we can tell those apart, we can see how much of it is just global slowing down. These were individual word productions, so maybe the global slowing down doesn't help as much. But nevertheless, I think it'd be good to kind of tell apart those two kind of changes. So yeah, thank you for asking that. Yeah.
Yes, I don't really have anything to add on that. It seems right that as Navin was saying, we can do that kind of analysis, but we haven't focused on that in this data set yet. So perhaps we'll have more answers in the future.
And maybe other paradigms. So we have truly interactive paradigms where they're actually finding. So we're borrowing the diapics task, which is interlocutors work together to find differences between pictures, and maybe those are kind of that's probably a better paradigm for looking for these kind of global changes and looking for specific phonetic changes in the problematic context. So, well, thank you for the idea. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I imagine myself actually waiting for the trailer of the second movie, or third one when it's a trilogy. So thank you for that. And I think it all comes up to the 3 points that you were mentioning, and task being one of them, right? So if we want to observe some specific changes, maybe we should go for, other instrument or task procedures. So I totally agree with that. Yeah. So I can see that we have no more questions on the chat. So would you both like to comment anything else or to add anything to the discussion?
Well, I will just say again, thank you again for giving us the opportunity to share this. This is ongoing work, so I'm sure there'll be, we'll probably figure out that some of the things that we presented probably needs to be re-examined, but that's what we are hoping to do. And so thank you.
Yes, and I'll also thank you. This was a lot of fun to come up with the talk and then to talk to you folks. And thank you for the nice questions. It's very interesting.
And we're happy to take questions later on if people have questions after viewing this video. So thank you.
Yeah, I did have like lots of questions, but not to be, like the boring student, just raising the hand lots of time, multiple times. So I would like, in the name of a Berlin ao Vivo series, to thank both of you, so Navin and Annie, for the great presentation. And also, I'm sure that we all have learned a lot. I know that I have learned a lot, and I'm going to have lots of homework afterwards. So thank you all, and we wish a nice afternoon of other presentations and series.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.